So today we have with us Aaron Thomas, who is a three-time winner of the Atlanta's Best Divorce Attorney and one of the nation's top experts in family law issues. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School. He has represented over 1,000 clients, including NBA Hall of Famers, Super Bowl winners, Grammy award-winning artists, and in a range from family law matters, including divorce, custody, child support, and prenuptial as well as postnuptial agreements. After years of helping clients navigating the demise of a toxic marriage, he decided to launch Prenups.com to help couples establish a solid financial foundation during the engagement so they can prevent some of the marital disputes. Thomas regularly shares his expertise on podcasts and with other media outlets. His first book, The Prenup Prescription, you got to read it if you haven't, was released in October of 2023, and it is available on Amazon. So I would like to welcome our guest for today, Aaron Thomas.
Thanks so much for having me, Bernadette. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to this conversation because it is so important in the work that I do as a forensic accountant, even as a tax accountant. I get to see some of the toxic side of marriage, and you've taught me some stuff, right? And so we're going to get into that. But can you just start us off by telling us what is the actual definition of a prenup? Because I don't know if we really have a complete understanding of what that is.
Yeah. And I'm glad you started with that question because there are a lot of misconceptions about what a prenup is and what it does, even on a basic level. So a prenup or a postnup is simply a set of rules that governs how your finances are treated both during and, if necessary, after a marriage. And I like to stress that during part because a lot of people, you hear the word prenup and you immediately think it is literally just a plan for your divorce. That all it does is decide how you split up your finances, in the event of a divorce. And a lot of people don't recognize that a prenup can help you manage your finances during the marriage itself.
Yeah, I was thinking that honestly, I was one of those people like to think that the prenup is just like if this thing don't work out, this is how we're gonna do it. But I love the fact that you teach and talk about how the prenup is a document that can truly help you stay married.
Yeah, it is. I think that couples should look at prenups and postnups like they are partnership agreements for your marriage. And I know that you and your audience really, understands things from kind of the perspective of a business. And certainly, some people are going to have a reaction, some kind of visceral reaction when they hear me compare a marriage to a business. You don't want to think of, your marriage in that way. But, the truth is marriage is the most important financial contract you're ever going to sign. That's not the only thing that marriage is, right? It has to do with family, it has to do with relationship, it has to do with love. But there is an undeniable financial element to marriage. And it is a legal relationship. There's a reason you go down to the courthouse and you fill out a marriage license at a courthouse because it has wide-ranging legal and financial implications. So, I do like to stress that, it's the partnership agreement for your marriage. A typical prenup will talk about, yes, it's going to talk about how you divide your assets in the event of a divorce. But like any partnership agreement, the purpose of a business partnership agreement is not just to decide who gets what out of the business when it falls apart. Any business partnership agreement worth the paper it's written on, of course, is going to include something that says what happens if one partner wants to buy out the other partner, or one partner leaves the business or passes away, what have you. But the goal of the partnership agreement is to keep the business running smoothly while the business is running. To make sure that each partner knows what their rights and responsibilities are with respect to the business. Same thing for a prenup. A prenup that says you keep what's in your name, I keep what's in my name, and we split 50-50 what we put in joint names could be fair or it could be unfair depending on what you were doing during the marriage. How does the money flow in and out of bank accounts? And who's contributing in what ways to what assets and who's paying what debts. So in my view, you can't write a prenup without talking about and really diving deep on what are the spouses doing during the relationship itself.
Yeah. And you said something that made me think about how a lot of times in relationships, couples aren't having these conversations. We're having conversations about where are we going to get married and what is the dress going to look like and who's going to be the best man. But there are a lot of conversations. And again, as a tax accountant, I've seen it where people aren't having the conversations about what's the status of your taxes. Are you current on your taxes? Do you owe Uncle Sam? Do you under withhold? All of these kind of conversations are conversations that need to be had. And a lot of times people aren't having these conversations, and just having them can save so much headache down the road.
That is 100% right. You don't have to be a long-term divorce lawyer to know that money is one of those topics that couples argue about virtually more than anything else. When you interview couples that are divorcing, one of the number one things that they bring up are money arguments. It may not be the only thing that was wrong in their marriage, but when marriages fall apart, money is almost always a source of stress. And I think that it stems from the fact that money is so difficult to talk about in general. I mean, you know that with your work and your business, we are not great as a society at talking about money. It's taboo. It's sometimes seen as rude to even bring up money in public conversation and talk to people about their finances. And particularly when it comes to dating, you go on a first date and you are not going to lay your net worth statement on the table. It is not
Right.
polite first date conversation. And for a lot of people, they're trying to put their best foot forward. They're trying to, promote their good sides and hide their flaws. And a lot of that comes to, you're not being transparent about your financial situation. And so to me, one of the greatest first benefits that a prenup does is for a prenup or postnup to be enforceable in all 50 states, each spouse has to disclose all of their assets and debts to the other spouse. And the way that we ensure that this requirement has been met in our agreements is we literally have each spouse write out all of their assets and debts on a piece of paper. We tally it up as a net worth statement for each spouse, and we attach those statements to the back of the agreement so that there is no question that information has been exchanged. And you would be surprised, well, maybe not you, but some people would be surprised how many people get married without having had at least that basic level of transparency. And what I've found is when couples do that, it is going to naturally spawn other important conversations that they need to be having, right? So, your net worth statement, I like to say that it's treated as a no judgment time. You are where you are. It is just a snapshot in time. And no one has saved up as much as they want for retirement. Everybody has probably more debt than they wish that they had. But you can, at least it prompts the conversation of, okay, how did you get to where you are? What are your feelings about debt? What are your feelings about investments? So are you a conservative investor? Are you dump everything into S&P 500? Are you putting all your entire nest egg into crypto? Are you somewhere in between? And it gives you the opportunity to at least get those issues out in the open and hopefully get on the same page with your fiance or spouse about how you got to where you are in your financial life.
So let's talk about like marital property versus separate property. What does that mean?
Yeah. Great question. So I think that most people have a general understanding that whatever you bring into a marriage should belong to you. right? That if something happens to your marriage, that you should keep what you came in with, right? Um, what you own prior to marriage is considered your separate property. Separate property is what belongs just to you, and marital property is what belongs to the couple. Where a lot of people get confused is what happens after the date that you are married. And under the law, every dollar that either spouse earns during the course of the marriage is considered marital property. And this is true no matter whose name is on a bank account, whose name is on a piece of property, whose name is on a retirement account. And so, I've had the conversation over and over and over with couples who are going through a divorce, and every single person comes in and says, "What do you mean he wants half of my retirement? What do you mean she wants half of the house that I paid the mortgage for?" Because, in our minds, we keep certain things separate. I get a paycheck, I put it in a bank account that has my name on it only, and I'm paying a mortgage on a property that I owned prior to the marriage that is in my name only. You would think that that remains your separate property, and it is not true under the law, and this is across the entire country. Once you are married, that first paycheck that you earn, everything that first paycheck touches becomes commingled and has an element of marital property to it. And so it doesn't matter if you keep your bank account separate. It doesn't matter if you keep everything in your own names. Everything that you earn and everything that those earnings touch during the course of the marriage is considered marital property and is up for division if that marriage comes to an end.
Wow. Yeah, that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people because again, in my industry, I see a lot of this is mine, this is his. I have couples that file separate tax returns, they kind of keep everything separate. And so to think that even though you go through all of this effort to keep things separately, it's still marital property. I don't know a lot of people aren't really thinking like that.
Yeah. And, it comes back to, really the definition of a prenup. I like to say that everybody has a prenup. If you get married, you have a prenup. You either have a prenup that you have written and you have customized and you signed on your own, or you have the default prenup that was written by the state that you happen to live in. It was probably written in the 1800s, right? And that is the reason why this setup is the way that it is because when the marriage laws were written in the United States, there was only one spouse who was going to be working, the man, and really the wife ceased to exist as a legal entity and could not own assets in her own name. Married women could not own assets in their own name for the majority of the United States being in existence. And so everything was in one bucket and owned by the man. And usually the wife was the homemaker and the man was the breadwinner. We do not live in that society any longer. And it is not unusual at all for the woman to be the higher breadwinner in the household. And two income households is now the norm. And so we've had these changes in our society, but the laws have not kept up with it. And so people get married and they assume I have my own bank accounts, I have my own credit cards, I have my own assets, I have my own debts. And the law doesn't look at it that way. They just mix everything into, kind of one pile. And it's not usually what people intend. It's not what's intuitive to people. And so, most people in getting a prenup, what they're doing is they're going back to a more intuitive approach and saying, let's just agree that, okay, what I have in my name belongs to me, what you have in your name belongs to you, and what we decide, what we intentionally put in joint names belongs to the two of us. And that way you're not unintentionally or accidentally creating marital property out of something that you believe to be separate and you and your spouse treated as though we're separate throughout your marriage.
So when you have a prenup, if you have a prenup in place, your prenup can actually create that separate property inside of the marriage.
That's right. You can override the state's laws and do what most people think makes sense. This idea that my earnings can go into my bank account and pay for an asset that I own prior to the marriage, and I somehow have created marital property is not intuitive for most people. It doesn't make it doesn't make sense to most people. And what most people want is to opt out of kind of the default prenup and say, all right, my earnings are going to continue to be my separate property. Now we can decide to create a joint account and have all of our earnings or a portion of our earnings go into that joint account. And that will be considered our marital property. And we can choose to have, a joint debt. We could have a family credit card or a household credit card, and that will be joint debt. But I find that most people want to have at least some things remain separate, particularly in today's day and age, the age that people get married today. And, people are not getting married at 21 anymore. The average age of a first marriage is 30, and getting married, later than that or a second time later in life is not unusual at all. And it doesn't make sense to throw everything that you own into one pile when you're getting married, under those kinds of circumstances. So I think it is just something that makes sense for a lot of couples. But you gotta have those conversations first. You gotta be open, in terms of, what you want your financial relationship to look like for that to even be possible, to be on the table.
Right. And like you said, the conversations, you got to have the conversations. So let's talk about, since a lot of my audience are business owners, what are some of the things that a business owner needs to be mindful of entering into a marriage, especially a business owner that may have an established business and now you're getting married? What are some of the things they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, yeah. And I love that this is your audience and we're getting the chance to have this conversation, because prenups and postnups are more important for business owners than any other type of individual. I mean, if you show me someone with a business doing $50,000 a year and somebody else who's worth $1 million, but they're a W-2 employee, I'm going to say that it is more important for the small business owner to have a prenup. And this is why. When it comes to what makes divorce so horrible and messy is the argument over dividing of assets. And every other type of asset has a pretty straightforward, reliable way to come up with a value for it. If you own a house, you can go get an appraisal, right? And even if you get two different appraisals, they're going to be within the same ballpark. They're going to be within the same range. If you have a bank account, the bank account is worth whatever the money is in the bank account. If you have a retirement account, maybe you deduct a little bit for taxes, that you expect to pay, but it's a very straightforward way to figure out what that's worth. Cars are worth whatever it says on Kelley Blue Book. Yes, divorce lawyers use Kelley Blue Book, to figure out what cars are worth. A business is very different in terms of how difficult it is to value. And I've seen many, many divorce cases where one spouse or the other is a business owner, and each goes and gets a business valuation expert. And one valuation expert can look at a business and say, this is a small business. It is owned by this one person. And if that one person isn't working, the business is worth zero, because they are the person who brings in all the business. They do the majority of the work. They can't sell this business off to somebody else. And so that business valuation expert could look at it and say it's worth nothing. And another business valuation expert working for the other spouse can say, well, I'm not looking at it like that. I'm looking at your 12 months trailing revenue, and I'm comparing it to other businesses in that industry who have sold, in this region of the country over the past few years. And I'm going to apply this multiple. And it is not unusual at all for one person to say this business is worth zero, and another expert to say this business is worth $1 million. And if you
Wow.
have one spouse's side saying this business is worth zero, and the other says it's worth $1 million, that case is going to trial. That case is going to court, and it is going to be expensive, because one spouse could see a $500,000 swing in their direction if the court buys their argument, right? And all of a sudden, it is mathematically worth it to spend $50, $100, $150,000 on experts and lawyers to fight this out in court. And it's a nightmare, right? And then on top of the difficulty in valuing a business in a divorce case, which, by the way, I have to point out that the person who is making the decision is typically the judge who works for the state. They're not actively a business owner usually.
Right.
A lot of times they've never had ownership in a business, and that is the person making the decision as to which business valuation expert is more credible. And I think a lot of judges would tell you themselves that they don't like making these decisions, because they're not the most qualified person to be making these decisions. And so, putting that decision in a courtroom is really a crapshoot and really dangerous for business owners. And then secondly, is the liquidity issue. If your business is found, if a business is found to be worth $500,000 in enterprise value, what are the chances that that business has $250,000 in liquid cash to be able to pay out a spouse in a divorce case? There's no business
Yeah,
that I know of that is
zero.
run
Yeah.
right, that is run like that. I mean, you know better than I do. You work with, business owners finances. And so I have seen business owners lose their business, have to file for bankruptcy. And they look at it as, you are keeping the house and all the retirement, and I'm keeping my job. I'm keeping my business because it's worth $500,000. So you get all the assets, and I basically get to keep my job in a divorce. And it's not unusual for them to file bankruptcy or have to be bought out of their business, or other business partners ask that person to leave because of the damage that it does to the business, to potentially have an owner that is an ex-spouse and is not really part of the business operations. And then along those same lines, the other big risk to business owners going through a divorce is the disruption to the day-to-day operations of the business itself. So if I am a divorce attorney and the spouse on the other side of my case is a business owner, I am going to want every single piece of paper that business owns. And I'm going to send subpoenas for all of the accounting documents, the profit and loss statement, the balance sheet, the accounts receivables, the copies of any contracts that the business is a party to, the formation documents, the articles of corporation and any bylaws, and any kind of meeting notes, minutes that the business has had. And complying with those kinds of subpoenas, particularly for a small business, is like adding an additional small part-time job for
Yeah.
somebody inside the business. And nobody wants that kind of business information exposed generally anyway. And certainly not with someone who is not on the best of terms with one of the business owners or one of the business partners. And so it is becoming increasingly more common for business partners to basically have an agreement that they all get prenups or postnups to protect the business from this type of disruption.
I never thought about this. I always talk to business owners about partnership agreements and contingency plans, but I never even thought about how prenups are a part of all of that, because just listening to you talk about all of these things, I can see how much of a nightmare that would be. I mean, to think about having to go and find bank statements for the last 5 years for your business and give those bank statements over to a spouse that's trying to take you for everything that you have, or whatever the case may be. That sounds painful.
Yeah, yeah, it is, a messy dissolution of a business and a messy dissolution of your marriage are best avoided at all costs. And I think that prenups and postnups should be looked at as just another kind of weapon in your arsenal, another item in your toolkit to prevent against, those types of things. A lot of people look at it like insurance, right? We have insurance to protect against basically any financial catastrophe that can come about in your life. You've got car insurance to protect against, being uninsured and being in a car accident, or home insurance to protect against, fire and other, damage that could happen to your home. We have life insurance to protect against an untimely death and the financial impact that has on your family. We have health insurance to protect against potentially catastrophic, medical costs that we could have. We have insurance for all of these types of things. And make no mistake about it, divorce is a financial catastrophe. It is, for typically both spouses. You're taking the income, the money, the assets that were to support one household, and now it has to support two households. Everybody takes a hit. No one's winning, quote unquote winning typically in a divorce case. It is something that is going to be financially painful for both spouses. And even in the context of business, you have certain types of insurance for important, key personnel in the business, and directors and that type of thing. And A prenup or a postnup is something that you hope you never need, just like these other insurance policies. But you certainly are glad that you have it. And if it can prevent you having a messy divorce, particularly if you have a business involved, it is well worth the cost, in my view.
So can we talk a little bit about postnups? Because we've mostly been talking about prenups, right? And so I want to talk to the business owner who's saying, oh shit, like I already have my business. I don't have a prenup. What do I do? Right. So this is where the postnup. So how do you have the conversation with a spouse? You've been married for 15 years. And how do you do that? You go home and say, honey, I think we need a postnup. How does this conversation even happen?
Yeah, yeah, and it's such the perfect topic to bring up, because how do you have the conversation is the $1 million question. We devoted an entire chapter of the book of the prenup prescription to having the conversation, because it is such an important piece. And a lot of business owners kind of have this business mindset, and they may be listening to this and thinking, okay, I get how it logically makes sense. But when I go home and have this conversation, it's going to be an emotional argument, and I can't just lay out the logic here. And I think that you know the big picture is there needs to be a lot of education about prenups and postnups, and the role that they can play in your marriage, because there is still so much stigma attached to, you just hear the term prenup and postnup, and so many people immediately their mind is going to go to, you think we're breaking up. You were planning for our eventual divorce. You think that, that we're on the rocks. Rather than looking at it like a partnership planning tool. And so, my advice in having the conversation, particularly about a postnuptial agreement, you're already married, you didn't have this conversation, prior to getting married, is to start with what it is that you want to accomplish, and have that conversation about, what is it that we're actually trying to do with this agreement, rather than if you walk right in and say, hey, baby, I want a postnup. You you can pretty much guarantee that question is, that conversation is going to be a little bit more tense. And so, I try to, look at all of the things that, a prenup or a postnup could do for me, and say, okay, would it be a good idea for us as a couple to be intentional with how our financial relationship is set up, and to ensure that, while communication is high, while the trust is high, while respect and love are at a high in our relationship, that we can decide, how we can best protect each other financially, rather than leave anything up to chance. And part of that is, can we be transparent about our finances and put everything down on paper about what our assets and debts? Can we have a mature conversation about what belongs to you, what belongs to me, and what belongs to the two of us? Because even if you are not having that conversation, if there's a disconnect between you and your spouse about what belongs to you as a couple and what belongs to each of you, that is going to cause friction in your relationship, even if it is never explicitly laid out like that. And then once you have that conversation, making sure that you've set up your finances in through a prenup or a postnup in a way that matches what you and your spouse's understanding is, I think, an easier sell than just coming in with the idea of, a prenup or a postnup. And so, a postnup can be used to shield your spouse from the debts of your business or the potential liability with your business. And if you're doing it in a fair manner, then I think it can be better received, right? So, for example, you could say all of the money that I earn, or that you earn, or maybe 50% of the money that each of us earn, is going to go into a joint account, a joint bucket. And that is going to be marital property. And no matter what happens, we're going to split that 50-50, no questions asked. We're not going to leave it up to even the possibility that we may fight each other in court over who gets what percentage of that marital property. And then each of us is going to have some own spending money in our own separate bank accounts that we can do what we want with, without any oversight or permission needed from the other spouse. I think a lot of people in today's world like having that autonomy over at least some portion of their income. And let's agree that the business is not going to go under, if our relationship doesn't work out. A lot of people will say, we're going to keep the business outside of the marital estate. It will be the separate property of whichever spouse owns it. But the income that you bring in comes into the household, and that is what is up for division. And I've seen a lot of postnups where basically couples have come to me and said, we have realized through education and, prenups and postnups are becoming way more common and way more accepted. The interest in getting prenups and postnups for marrying couples is 4 times what it was just 12 years ago. So there's been a real sea change in terms of, the acceptance of prenups and postnups. And a lot of people are now looking at them as just like the smart thing to do, to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where you're spending 25% of your net worth on lawyers to fight over who gets the other 75% of what you've got.
Or more.
And a lot of people, when they're on good terms, are way more willing to say, of course, that's your business. You work, I don't work in your business. You work in your business. That is owned by you. Of course it is. And these other things, our house, our joint account, our household credit card, these are the joint things. But if I go run up my credit card over here on the side, no, I don't expect you to be responsible for that. If I'm taking out debt to try to get my business off the ground, no, I don't expect my spouse to be on the hook for that. And so even, the other thing that I would like to bring up is even if you don't actually go through with getting the prenup or the postnup, these are conversations that you need to be having with your spouse. And so even if that conversation doesn't happen in the, even if the word prenup or postnup doesn't come up in that first conversation that you have with your spouse, it is still a worthwhile exercise to sit down with your significant other and say, I'd like to be more intentional about how we are treating our household finances. And yes, part of that conversation can be budgeting, and it doesn't have to be doom and gloom. It can be, my wife and I, we have a clause that says we're going to put 5% of our household income into a travel fund because we agree that that is a value for both of us. It is something that we want to make sure that we continue to do throughout the course of our relationship. Even though we got, a young child, we want to still be real intentional about traveling. And so, I like to encourage couples to put kind of like positive or forward-looking clauses in their prenup or postnup for things that they and their spouse are aligned on financially. For us, it was, making sure that whenever we want to take a trip, the money is there for the travel. And because we're putting 5% of our, money aside, the more each of us earns, the bigger trips or the longer trips, we can take, or the more often, we can travel. For some people, that may be a baby fund or buying a rental property or, moving to a new home or getting a new car. But there is something financially that you and your spouse can get on the same page on, and approaching it from that angle of like, where are we aligned first, rather than what do we do when we split up, I think is a healthier way to go about having this conversation.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about, because I know when I read your book, you shared like I keep thinking about like you were thinking like, why would I ever want to get married? It's based on just based on all of these things. But I love how you were able to see, hey, this is a way that you can have that and and stay married. So I was going to ask you to share some of that from your personal prenup.
Yeah. And if I can just throw in a couple other examples of provisions that people include in their postnups or prenups that contribute to the health of a marriage and not just the divorce. One of the other things that my wife and I decided is, and I saw this in my divorce work, that when one spouse would want to go do marriage counseling, the other spouse wasn't interested. And then that spouse had finally come around to the idea, and the first spouse had given up on the marriage, given up on the idea of saving the relationship. And my wife and I decided that we were not going to allow that to happen in our relationship. And we just said, okay, we're going to agree on the front end that if either one of us wants to go to counseling, we're going to counseling. And we put a provision in our agreement that says Either one of us could trigger this provision, trigger this clause, and we'd be required to go to no more than 3 counseling sessions per year. We could do more than that voluntarily, but we could require each other to go to 3 counseling sessions per year. And if either of us wanted to file for a divorce, we would have to go to 6 counseling sessions before we could initiate a divorce case. And that way, we could at least kind of put it in black and white that we were committed to at least giving it that much effort to try to save the relationship rather than let things go down, the path of divorce without at least being able to say that we gave it the best shot we could have to save the relationship. And then there are other things that you can do to kind of encourage ongoing communication about finances in your household. So another example is we put a clause that says we're going to discuss any expenses that come out of the joint bank account over $500. We've got to have a conversation ahead of time. And what I've learned from, doing prenups, lots of prenups over the past several years is that every couple, regardless of, their financial status or how wealthy they are, has some amount of money that they want, that if it's coming out of the joint bank account, there wanted to be some discussion ahead of time. I had one person, very wealthy athlete who was like, anything under $10,000, I don't need to know about. You can swipe the card for anything up to that amount. But if it's over $10,000, I want to know. So even if you're a multimillionaire, there is an amount that if it goes missing from the joint bank account and there hasn't been a discussion ahead of time, you're going to feel some kind of way about it. And what I've found is in practice, me and my wife discuss expenses that are way below $500 coming out of the joint account because we've built this kind of habit into our relationship that, it's mutual respect. We're going to ask each other, when you're spending, several $100s from a joint account, that is something that impacts the other person. And we are going to discuss that thing ahead of time as a sign of mutual respect. And it's my belief, possibly naive, but it's my belief that if you get in the habit of discussing financial things that impact your spouse with each other, you kind of get in that habit, even if it might be slightly uncomfortable to have these kinds of conversations, that will bleed over into other parts of your relationship, that you are exercising the habits of transparency and communication in your relationship. And even if it is a little bit sticky, overall, it is to the benefit of your relationship.
Yeah, and if you can have the financial conversation, that's the hardest conversation. So then you can talk about the other stuff. And so I know we're talking mostly about like the finances as it relates to it, but one of the things that you say even in your LinkedIn tagline, like that you write prenups that help people to stay married. So what are some non-financial things that you've seen included in prenups that help people stay married? Because I want people to understand that the prenup is not just about money, and making sure that you have this agreement is not about just how we're going to split the money or how we're going to spend the money. So
yeah. So, one of the biggest things is that counseling provision. But what a lot of couples will implement that I think is also a great idea is having kind of a regular household meeting. I think in the book I call it the annual shareholders meeting because we take that business analogy, and it is a good analogy, and we stretch it out as far as we can take it. But and a lot of times what people will discuss at the annual meeting is finances. But it can also serve as a checkpoint to discuss other parts of the relationship. Do we need counseling? Is this the year that that one of us takes a break from the workforce? Do we want to move to a new place or a new city altogether?
Or a new country.
Right, a new country, exactly. as some of us, have managed to pull off. Or conversations about kids, how many, or a lot of us are in that sandwich generation where we're, thinking about both our children as well as potentially aging parents. And, would you ever have an aging parent or another relative, move into your household? And those kinds of, conversations that may be more difficult, you can encourage that kind of communication in a prenup by kind of writing in, we're going to have, regular counseling, we're going to have regular meetings, we're going to sit down, we're going to do, these kinds of things. Even as far as, when you're talking about money, that brings into, are we private school for our kids people? Are we public school for our kids people? And so, one of the things that I say in the book is that the financial dynamics of your marriage dictate the personal dynamics of your marriage. And so, a lot of people think about finances, but you really can't separate your financial relationship from your greater relationship. A case in point, I did a divorce case once where the husband was the only spouse who worked in the household, and he earned good money, $200,000 a year, and his wife was home raising their kids, and he gave her an allowance of $300 a month. That's all she had to spend on herself throughout the relationship. And without knowing anything else about this couple, you can probably guess a whole bunch of things, non-financial things about their relationship, right? If you have that kind of inequity on the financial front, if the husband and wife are living in totally different socioeconomic brackets in their household, you can imagine what the rest of their relationship was. And you cannot have fair and equal power dynamics in a household where the finances are set up that way. And so, yeah, I think that, on the surface, a lot of what we're talking about is the finances, but it is going to stretch over into every part of your relationship. If you have inequity or, unfair contributions or unfair, kind of access to information, those kinds of things in problematic issues in your financial relationship, you're going to have them in the rest of your relationship as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know we could talk about this forever, because I'm a numbers nerd and you are. But I want
Likewise,
to say,
guilty.
like, as we wrap up, what is something that I didn't ask you that you want to share with our listeners? Or maybe I asked you everything. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would bring up is there is a misconception that you have to be rich to benefit from a prenup. That prenups are, even before I started practicing family law, I thought the same thing. I heard prenup or postnup, and I thought like wealthy Hollywood or oil tycoon, person needing to protect millions and millions of dollars of wealth. And the truth is that virtually everybody can benefit from a prenup, especially people who, if you don't have the money to pay lawyers for a year and a half while going through divorce litigation, then it may be all that more important for you to decide what your financial relationship is between you and your spouse in a relatively inexpensive document that, is a fraction of the cost of your average contested divorce case. And so if you think about, a prenup as kind of a partnership plan for your marriage, that is not something that you need to be a multimillionaire to benefit from. In fact, if you got millions and millions, then you're both probably fine. And if you ever needed to, you could both afford to pay lawyers forever if necessary. But, when you're talking about, financial planning and getting on the same page and being transparent about your assets and debts and coming up with a plan for what's mine, what's yours, what's ours, and developing rules about ongoing communication, whether that's, how much you can spend from joint bank accounts or going to counseling or, what kind of lifestyle you want to have together. These are things that are not solely the domain of the ultra wealthy. And that's something that I would love to, to get across to your audience.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that when I read your book, I realized that I too had that perception. Like, you have to be a really rich person. Even when I got married, I'm thinking, I don't really own that much stuff, to need a prenup. Ooh, was I wrong? So so yeah. Hopefully the information that you shared today is going to help our listeners understand, or at least start having these tough conversations. So even if you don't hire Aaron to write your prenup or someone else to write your prenup. At least start having these conversations, because we know that money makes the world go round. Like, people say stuff about money doesn't make you happy and all this other stuff, but money has a chokehold on almost everything that we do, because with it you can do certain things, and without it, it definitely limits the things that you can do. So can you tell us, as we wrap up, tell our listeners where they can get your book, how they can get in touch with you, and all of that good stuff?
Yes. So you can find basically links to everything that we've got on our website, prenups.com. You can get there's a link to buy the book. It is on Amazon. It's called The Prenup Prescription. And then we're also on all the social media channels, Prenup Guy.
I love it, Prenup Guy. So thank you so much for being here today. This was awesome. And I know that it's going to help a whole lot of people. So thanks for taking out the time today to be here.
Thanks so much for having me, Bernadette. It's been great.